Hey, good morning, everybody. It's time for another lesson on APUSH history. This is chapter 11, Triumphs and Travails of the Jeffersonian Republic. We're looking at the administration of Thomas Jefferson and how Jefferson was a man of principle and yet a very practical president. In this section, we'll be looking at the Revolution of 1800 and how a partisan press influenced these early elections, how the election between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams actually ended in a tie between Jefferson and his running mate, Aaron Burr, and how this particular election has become known as the Revolution of 1800 for its peaceful conclusion. Throughout this lesson and other lessons dealing with Thomas Jefferson, we're going to be comparing and contrasting two Thomas Jeffersons, the idealist versus the pragmatist. And we're going to see that his anti-federalist principles didn't always win out over the need to use the value of using a stronger national government. The election of 1800 put Federalists against the unified force of the Democratic Republicans under Thomas Jefferson. The Federalists were facing several different handicaps. As we talked about with John Adams, the Alien and Sedition Acts had incited many enemies. The challenge to the constitutional right to free speech and the persecution of newspaper publishers who had been critical of the Federalists were at the front of the public's mind during this particular election. Also, the conflict between Adams' administration and the French following the XYZ affair put the United States in an undeclared war with France. As we talked about in class, Adams followed Washington's precedent of officially remaining neutral, but conflict on the high seas between France and the United States has been called the quasi-war. And the U.S. was feverishly preparing for war with France, increasing the national debt and requiring new taxes, including a Stamp Act, which is ironic considering the influence of a Stamp Act during the American Revolution. Military preparations ended up being unnecessary when the French Revolution ended. A military dictatorship under Napoleon Bonaparte arose, and for at least a few years, a tentative peace on the high seas took place. But this mudslinging or exchange of ugly criticisms in the press between the anti-federalists and federalists took place on both sides. The Federalists concentrated their fire on Jefferson's own personal life. They used rumors that he had multiple children by his slaves, including Sally Hemings, an issue that was later proven to be accurate through the use of DNA testing. As we've talked about in class, Hemings and Jefferson had about at least 6 children together, 4 of which survived childhood. When Jefferson eventually gets into his old age, he allows 2 to run away, and the other 2 he frees with his will, and passes Sally Hemings on to his sister and encourages her to give her her time, meaning allow her to become free or to live her own life. But Jefferson was also the speculation, or was speculated to be an atheist, which was certainly taboo at this time. He had been a liberal as far as religious values go. He was more of a deist, believing that if there were a creator, it was like an inventor who created an invention and then left it alone. He had dabbled with rewriting passages in the Bible in which he took out the miracles of Jesus. And so he was a product of the Enlightenment, and people were fearful that if he were elected, that he would abolish or become an enemy of religion. And so conservative Federalists were terrified, and there are rumors of old women hiding their Bibles, burying them, or placing them in their wells so that the anti-Federalists, Thomas Jefferson, wouldn't come and take them. But it was all political speculation, as we're very used to the kinds of wild rumor mongering that takes place in our own elections today. Here's a political cartoon comparing Washington and Jefferson circa 1807. You can see here the Federalists are evidently the party of God. You can see divine light emanating from Washington, the lion suggesting nobility, and the eagle suggesting patriotism. You can see Washington perched on a platform of law and order and religion, and meanwhile Jefferson under the stormy clouds of a godless nation. You could see the alligator and the snakes, and him being a danger, a threat to everything that is good about America. Here's another infamous political cartoon. This one stemmed from Jefferson's 1804 re-election campaign. You can see the innuendo of this: Jefferson dressed as a rooster, and in the background, Sally Hemings as a hen. All of the double entendre of the title of this particular political cartoon suggesting that as a philosopher, he was espousing and crowing one thing, but as a slave owner and as someone who philandered with his servants, that he was a man of impulse and sexual drive. We'll put it that way. But Jefferson did win both of his elections, 1800 and 1804. But the one we really want to focus on here is 1800. He did end up defeating Adams. In fact, Adams finished third in this election. Jefferson tied 73 to 73 with his running mate, Aaron Burr, who Jefferson had recruited, another Democratic Republican, to help try to secure the battleground state of New York. We're dealing with a time in history where the Electoral College didn't distinguish between president and vice president in their voting. And so the election ends with a dead tie between between Jefferson and Burr. Neither of them wants to be vice president. And so it goes into a runoff vote in the House of Representatives, which is the constitutional requirement for such cases where there isn't somebody that has a majority of the votes. The House of Representatives was also deadlocked. They voted on the matter several dozen times, upwards of 35 times, before a couple of Federalists, at the recommendation of Alexander Hamilton, decided to withhold their votes and pitch the election to Jefferson. Hamilton, although he had always been a rival of Jefferson, was even more skeptical of Burr, fearing that Burr was even more radical than Jefferson. This particular conflict we'll look at later down the road, because ultimately it's Aaron Burr who challenges Hamilton to a duel and ends the life of the most prolific Federalist in the American Revolutionary period. This map demonstrates the presidential election of 1800. New York, as I said, was a key state in this election, and Aaron Burr helped swing it away from the Federalists with tactics that anticipated the rise of political machines, campaigning in the modern day sense. During the early part of the 19th century, not only taboo, but considered uncouth or counterproductive. People were expected that if they wanted to run for office, to wait for someone to ask them, and then they would grudgingly agree to run out of civic duty, to this kind of fake humility to demonstrate that they weren't ambitious or weren't seeking power for themselves, but doing it for the nation's good. Well, Burr didn't have any of that. In fact, he was well known to go and campaign in taverns and pubs and bars. One Federalist complained that Burr traveled every night from one meeting of Republicans to another, haranguing them with speeches. He'd stoop so low to visit taverns and where he'd work with drunk crowds and whip them into a frenzy. And that at the end of the election of 1800, Burr was so boastful as to say to the Federalists that they had won by superior management, meaning superior campaigning, not necessarily by superior policies. Sometimes referred to as the Revolution of 1800 because no revolution in the history of the world had taken place peacefully. Now, usually we think about revolutions as two opposing factions building up armies and going to war with one another, spilling blood, and eventually one side being defeated or conquered. This was not that type of revolution. Jefferson narrowly squeaked out a political victory, and Adams leaves office peacefully, rides away from Washington, D.C., and the peace of the public is maintained. And this has been the tradition ever since, that when one party is defeated, the other party goes back home, regathers itself, and prepares for the next election. Jefferson saw his mission as to restore the republic to its original design during the American Revolution, to restore states' rights, to limit the power of the national government, to limit its spending, to reduce its debt, to maintain a small or smaller force of military, and really to allow the states once again to lead the way for republicanism. Peaceful and orderly transition of power was revolutionary. It's remarkable for any young nation, especially at this time in world history where it had never happened before. We could take pride in the fact that this has been our tradition in democracy, with the exception of the Civil War era. With the eviction of the Federalists, Jefferson set to work at fixing some of the Federalists' greatest excesses. He enacted a new naturalization law that repealed the Alien Acts that were passed by Adams, reduced the requirement of 14 years back to the 5-year requirement for citizenship, and he had Congress repeal the excise tax, or the whiskey tax, because it was hurting farmers. Yet Jefferson, in practice, reversed many political principles he championed. He was consistently inconsistent. He dismissed very few public servants for political reasons. In fact, most Federalist appointees continued to serve Jefferson throughout his presidency. He didn't tamper with the funding of the national debt as set up by Alexander Hamilton. He launched no attacks against the Bank of the United States. He did not repeal the mild protective tariff that the Washington administration had set in place. And in future years, he rechartered the bank and bolstered the protective tariffs to even higher levels. So Jefferson's moderation cemented this idea of revolution because he showed that political change didn't need to be excessive or extreme or disastrous to the defeated group, that somewhere in moderation rested the interest of the people. To recap this section, we've talked about the Revolution of 1800. We looked at how the partisan press has always been a part of our political system, that personal attack ads and speculation on the personal lives of politicians existed all the way back to the times of Adams and Jefferson. Jefferson is the first president that really faces a sex scandal, and these things are all too common in our own era. The people, the citizens of the 19th century, cared less about those kinds of things. Jefferson won both of his elections. 1800 and 1804, despite those matters. But we also see the issue of the Electoral College, the fact that the electors didn't cast a vote for president and vice president because of the lessons learned in the election of 1796. Jefferson and Adams run with running mates, but this creates a tie between Jefferson and his running mate, Aaron Burr. That tie is decided by the House of Representatives, and the influence of Alexander Hamilton comes into effect with him pushing Federalists to choose Jefferson, a more moderate candidate, over Burr. The peaceful transition of power is why we call this the Revolution of 1800. It was a landmark in world history, and it teaches us that one party can move in and out of power peacefully, and that we don't have to see an extreme swing of politics the way that revolutions typically had taken place. And we've also been introduced to the idea of two Thomas Jeffersons, the idealist who wrote the Declaration of Independence and championed anti-federalist causes versus the pragmatist, the president who ran his office in a moderate and predictable kind of way that is going to ultimately push for stronger centralized power.